They called me a scentless null, a mistake in a world where scent is power, until the night I kissed the stone statue of the Alpha King and felt his frozen heart beat back against my lips. I broke his 100-year curse, only to realize I've become his blood anchor. The only thing stopping him from becoming a feral monster. But the council has already found my secret. My eyes are the key to the prophecy, and they'll tear them out of my head to keep the king in his cage.
Hi! Welcome to Vine Romance, where love speaks and hearts connect. If you believe in beautiful love stories, hit subscribe, like, and comment. And kindly join our growing family. Let's grow in love together.
Chapter 1. I didn't just touch a statue, I kissed a tombstone, and now the ghost of his hunger is vibrating in my very marrow. The cursed gallery was always cold, but tonight, the air felt like it was made of jagged glass. Ilara kept her head down, her scrub brush rhythmically shushing against the marble floors, because she knew that silence was her only shield. She was a null, a wolf born without a scent, which made her a ghost among the predatory elites of the High Citadel. Truth be told, she liked being a ghost. If the High Council ever smelled the golden fire of her secret seer lineage, they would harvest her eyes to fuel the kingdom's dying wards. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop the trembling in her hands as she approached the center of the hall. There stood King Fenris, encased in granite for 100 years, a jagged monument of frozen fury. Most maids avoided this spot, but Ilara felt a strange pull toward the stone. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the desperation of a girl with nowhere left to run. She reached out, her fingers brushing the soot off the statue's cold gray chest. In that moment, the world tilted. A heavy, wet thud echoed in her mind. Not her own heart, but a rhythmic, ancient vibration. Under the weight of his stare, even through stone, she felt a predatory focus pin her to the spot. What followed was a moment of pure, irrational madness. Ilara leaned in, her lips meeting the jagged stone of his mouth in a plea for a miracle. Without warning, a thin crack appeared on the statue's throat. As the silence roared, a sharp, electric scent of ozone filled her lungs, the first thing she had ever truly smelled. She pulled back, her chest aching with a sudden, violent hope. To make things worse, the heavy doors of the gallery groaned open. "Still cleaning the trash, Null?" A voice sneered. It was Silas, a council guard with a cruel smile and a scent like rotting leaves. Ilara froze, her heart skipping a beat as he stepped closer. She didn't know what scared her more, the guard's silver-tipped whip or the fact that the statue behind her was starting to radiate heat. Next, Ilara had to protect her only living reason for staying in this hellhole. She hurried toward the servants' quarters, her thoughts spinning with the rhythm of that stone heartbeat. Her brother Leo.
I was waiting for her in their tiny, damp room. He was only 10, but deep down, she knew the truth. His powers were starting to show. Small objects floated when he slept, and the council's harvest ritual was only days away.
"Did you find a way out, Ilara?" Leo whispered, his eyes wide and trusting. "I'm trying, Leo. I promise," she replied, though her voice trembled. She had to get him past the gates, but nulls weren't allowed to leave without a master's seal. Because of that, they were trapped like rats in a golden cage. Not only that, but the High Council had increased the guard patrols. In fact, the atmosphere in the Citadel had turned toxic. Every wolf was on edge, sensing the shift in the air. Ilara sat on the edge of her thin mattress, her bones remembering the heat of the king's stone skin. She wondered if she was going crazy. Why did a dead king feel more alive than the monsters ruling the city? As the night deepened, she heard the distant howl of a Silverclaw enforcer. It was a sound of pure terror. Soon after, a frantic knocking startled them. Ilara shoved Leo under the bed before she could move to the door. It was Mira, another maid, her face pale and her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. "They're starting the pre-selection tonight," Mira hissed. "They're checking everyone, even the nulls." She felt it, etched in fire, the sudden realization that her time had run out. If they tested her, they would find the seer blood. After that, she would be a blind prisoner, and Leo would be left alone. She grabbed her cloak, her instincts surging with the need to hide. But where? The only place the guards avoided was the cursed gallery at night, because they feared the Ghost King. Moments later, Ilara was sprinting back through the dark corridors. Her breath caught in her throat as she slipped into the gallery once more. The statue of Fenris looked different in the moonlight. The cracks were wider now, glowing with a faint, molten light. She ran to him, pressing her palms against the granite. "Please," she whispered. "If you can hear me, wake up." Without thinking, she pressed her forehead against his chest. The space between them burned. Suddenly, the stone didn't feel like stone anymore. It felt like muscle. It felt like skin. Between one breath and the next, the entire gallery shook with a low, rumbling groan. The granite began to peel away like old parchment, falling in heavy shards that shattered on the floor. Even so, Ilara didn't move. She couldn't. A massive hand, warm and calloused, wrapped around her waist. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. The statue was gone, and in its place stood a man, a giant with obsidian black fur along his shoulders and eyes like dying stars. Fenris was awake, and his grip was so tight it bruised. "You," he growled. The sound was primal, a deep vibration that shook her soul. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a beast who hadn't fed in a century. Yet, when his eyes locked on hers, the fear in Ilara's chest turned into something else, a wild, soaring heat. Before either could speak, the gallery doors burst open again. A dozen guards stood there, their silver spears gleaming. "The king is free!" Silas shouted, but his voice was full of terror. Fenris let out a roar that shattered the remaining windows. He moved like a blur of shadow and fury. Ilara watched, her heart pounding, as he tore through the guards with his bare hands. He didn't use a sword. He used the raw, brutal strength of an alpha. But then, as the last guard fell, Fenris stumbled. His body began to flicker, turning back into gray, cold stone. "No!" Ilara cried, lunging forward. She grabbed his hand, and the moment their skin touched, the petrification stopped. She was the blood anchor. Because she was a null, she was the only one who could ground his ancient, volatile magic. He leaned into her, his scent of rain and starlight finally filling her world. "Don't let go," he rasped against her ear. "Never," she whispered, realizing that her life of being invisible was over. That night, they fled into the shivering darkness of the woods. Ilara looked back at the citadel, knowing she had just started a war. But as her wolf stirred for the first time, she knew she wasn't just a maid anymore. She was the anchor for a king, and together, they would burn the world down to save what was theirs. And she let it happen. The cold bite of the mountain air was a shock, but the heat radiating from the man beside her was a furnace. Ilara stumbled through the thick underbrush, her hand locked in Fenris's iron grip because she knew the moment she let go, he would turn back into a silent, frozen tomb. Her world tilted as they navigated the jagged rocks of the Iron Ridge, far from the polished marble of the citadel. She didn't know what scared her more, the army of Silverclaw enforcers hunting them, or the raw, primal power of the king who refused to release her palm. Still, the silence between them was heavy, filled only by the sound of their jagged breathing and the distant, rhythmic howling of the council's hounds. Fenris moved with a predatory grace that felt alien in this century, his obsidian fur bristling with every shift in the wind. As the silence roared, Ilara realized she had never been this far from the city walls. In fact, she had spent her entire life trying to be a shadow. Yet here she was, the only thing keeping a godlike beast from crumbling into dust. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her voice trembling in the dark. What followed was a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through their joined hands. Fenris didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the moon hung like a silver blade. Rather than answering, he pulled her closer, his body shielding her from the whip of the freezing wind. Because she was a null, she couldn't smell the fear of the forest, but she could feel the tension in his muscles. It was as if the world narrowed down to the heat of his skin against hers. Eventually, they reached a shallow cave hidden beneath a canopy of ancient pines. Fenris shoved her inside, his movements rough and frantic. The moment he tried to pull his hand away to scout the entrance, his fingers began to turn a sickly mottled gray. With a gasp of pain, he lunged back toward her, pinning her against the damp stone wall. "Don't move," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding tectonic plates. "I'm not going anywhere," Ilara choked out, her heart skipping as his face hovered inches from hers. Truth be told, she was terrified of the hunger in his eyes, a deep, centuries-old thirst that seemed to see right through her null mask. Between one breath and the next, the space between them burned with a desperate tactile necessity. He was an alpha king who had lost everything, and she was a maid who had never had anything at all. Moments later, the sound of breaking branches echoed outside the cave. Ilara felt it, etched in fire, the realization that the council's trackers had found them much faster than she'd hoped. Despite that, Fenris didn't shift into his wolf form. He stayed in his towering, half-human state, his obsidian claws extending as he watched the cave mouth. Not only that, but he moved his body to completely cover hers, a living shield of muscle and fur. "They want the seer," he muttered, his breath hot against her neck. "They want your eyes, little ghost." "How do you know what I am?" she asked, her thoughts spinning. Maybe it was fate, or maybe the bond allowed him to taste the golden light in her blood. Before she could move, a silver-tipped arrow hissed through the air, thudding into the dirt at their feet. The air thickened with the scent of ozone and burnt earth. Without thinking, Ilara gripped his arm tighter, her soul answering the call of his dormant power. As the bond pulsed, she felt a surge of ancient strength flowing from him into her, a gift of protection she hadn't earned but desperately needed. Next, the first of the Silver Claw enforcers burst into the clearing. He was a massive gray wolf, his eyes clouded with the council's madness. Still, he hesitated when he saw Fenris. The king didn't wait. He lunged, a blur of shadow and fury, while keeping his left hand firmly clamped onto Ilara's wrist. It was a chaotic, brutal dance. Fenris fought with his free hand and his teeth, tearing into the enforcer with a savagery that made Ilara's stomach churn. To make things worse, 3 more wolves emerged from the shadows. Ilara realized they weren't just here to capture them. They were here to kill the king and harvest her eyes on the spot. Because of that, she stopped trying to pull away and instead leaned into him, bracing her weight against his. As if summoned by her resolve, the air in the cave began to glow with a faint, amber light. "Fenris, look out!" she screamed as a wolf leaped for his throat. Without another word, Fenris spun, his obsidian fur flashing in the amber light. He caught the wolf in midair, snapping its neck with a sickening crack. Yet the strain of the blood anchor was taking its toll. Ilara could feel his energy draining, his skin growing cold and rigid where she wasn't touching him. She knew the truth. If she didn't find a way to stabilize him, the stone would take him back before the sun rose. Soon after, the remaining enforcers retreated into the trees, sensing the terrifying power radiating from the cave. Fenris collapsed to his knees, dragging Ilara down with him. His breathing was shallow, his eyes flickering between gold and gray. Deep down, she knew the truth. The anchor was a two-way street. He needed her life force to stay human, but she was just a girl, and her strength was fading. Looking back, I should have realized the cost of waking a king, she whispered, stroking his matted fur. Sleep, he commanded, though his voice was barely a whisper. He pulled her into the curve of his body, his obsidian tail wrapping around her legs. Even so, the tension didn't break. Ilara lay there, her heart pounding against his ribs, so wondering what had happened to Leo. Was her brother safe, or had the council already taken him? This was the first open loop in her mind, a nagging fear that kept her from finding peace. More importantly, she realized that Fenris wasn't just her protector. He was her prisoner, and she was his. Come morning, the forest was eerily silent. Ilara woke to find Fenris watching her, his expression unreadable. The gray tint had receded from his skin, but his eyes were darker, more possessive. She felt it. Something inside her shifted. She wasn't just a maid anymore, and he wasn't just a statue. They were a weapon forged in the dark, and the council had no idea what was coming for them. And she let it happen.
The sun rose like a bruised plum over the iron ridge, but the light brought no warmth to Ilara's soul. She moved through the skeletal trees with Fenris, their hands still fused together, as if fate had welded them in blood and fire. Because of the blood anchor, every step she took felt like dragging a mountain, yet the sheer heat of him kept her heart from freezing. She watched the way his obsidian fur caught the morning light, shimmering with a primal beauty that made her pulse race. Truth be told, she was starting to forget the face of the girl who had scrubbed floors only 48 hours ago. Still, the forest held its breath as they entered the dead zone, a stretch of woods where the council's magic had bled the land dry. Ilara felt the absence of life like a physical weight, her seer instincts screaming that they were being watched. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the image of her brother Leo being dragged to the ritual altar. What followed was a sudden sharp tug on her arm as Fenris stopped dead, his nostrils flaring. "Someone is here," he rumbled, his voice a low vibration that traveled through her skin. Next, a figure stepped from behind a blackened oak tree. It wasn't a guard, but a woman dressed in furs, her eyes a piercing, unnatural violet. Ilara froze, her breath catching as the stranger raised a hand. Fenris let out a warning growl, his claws sinking into the dirt, but the woman didn't flinch. In fact, she looked at their joined hands with a mixture of awe and pity. "The ghost and the king," the woman whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "The prophecy didn't mention how much it would hurt to look at you." "Who are you?" Ilara asked, her voice trembling. Instead of answering, the woman pointed toward a hidden path shrouded in thick mist. She told them her name was Hestia, an outcast from a pack the council had slaughtered decades ago. Because of that, she offered them a choice. Follow her to a hidden sanctuary, or stay and be hunted by the Silver Claw battalion currently circling the ridge. Ilara looked at Fenris, seeing the gray stone creeping up his neck again. She knew he was reaching his limit. He needed more than just a touch to survive the day. Moments later, they were deep in the mist, following Hestia toward a waterfall that seemed to flow upward. The air thickened with a strange, sweet scent, the first time Ilara had smelled something beautiful since the awakening. As the silence stretched, Hestia explained the rules of this new world. To make things worse, she revealed that the blood anchor wasn't just a tether. It was a siphon that would eventually drain Ilara's life entirely, unless they found the Luna Well. "I don't care about the cost," Ilara said, her resolve hardening. Fenris stopped, turning her to face him with a sudden predatory intensity. Under the weight of his stare, she felt her knees go weak. He didn't want her to die for him, yet his wolf demanded her proximity. The space between them burned as he reached out with his free hand, gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was a paradox, rough enough to kill, but soft enough to make her want to stay in this nightmare forever. Soon after, they reached the Luna Well, a glowing pool of silver liquid tucked inside a crystalline cavern. This was their first real test. Hestia warned them that to stabilize the bond, they had to submerge themselves together. But the water would force them to confront each other's darkest memories. In that moment,
Alara felt a surge of pure terror. She wasn't ready for him to see the shame of her null years, nor was she sure she could handle the weight of his royal slaughter. "Together," Fenris commanded, his golden eyes locking onto hers. Without another word, they stepped into the silver water. Time stood still as the cold liquid rose past their waists. Suddenly, Alara wasn't in the cave anymore. She was back in the citadel, watching herself be mocked by the guards. But then, the vision shifted. She felt Fenris's memory, the agony of the first stone casing his skin, the screams of his people, and the crushing loneliness of 100 years. As the truth unraveled, she realized they were two halves of the same broken soul. In the quiet that followed, they emerged from the well, the silver water clinging to them like liquid starlight. Something inside her shifted. The blood anchor no longer felt like a heavy chain. It felt like a part of her anatomy. Even so, the peace was short-lived. A beat later, a massive explosion rocked the cavern entrance. The council hadn't just followed them. They had brought a wolfbane mortar, a weapon designed to level mountains. "Run!" Hestia screamed, but it was too late. The ceiling began to collapse. Fenris lunged, his body moving on instinct to shield Alara from the falling crystal. To make things worse, a shadow stepped through the smoke. Silas, the guard from the gallery, now wearing a suit of silver mesh armor. He looked at Alara with a hungry focus that made her skin crawl. More importantly, he held a shimmering glass vial containing a lock of Leo's hair. "Come back with me, little seer," Silas sneered, "or the boy's throat is next." Eventually, the dust settled, leaving Alara standing between a dying king and a ruthless hunter. Her chest ached with the impossible choice. She felt it, etched in fire, the primal roar of her own wolf, finally breaking through the silence of her null heritage. She looked at Fenris, whose eyes were wide with the mix of fury and fear for her. Between them, something cracked. Not the bond, but the last of Alara's hesitation. "I am the seer," she shouted, her voice echoing like thunder. "And you will never touch him again." And she let it happen. The smoke in the cavern tasted like bitter copper and crushed dreams. Alara stood her ground, her fingers digging into Fenris's palm because she could feel the stone hunger clawing at his skin again. Across the rubble, Silas stood with a smirk that made her stomach churn, dangling the vial of Leo's hair like a fisherman with a hook. She didn't know what scared her more, the threat to her brother or the cold, calculated way Silas looked at her as if she were a piece of meat to be carved. Still, the air between them thickened with a new, dangerous energy. Fenris tried to lunge forward, but his knees buckled, his body vibrating with the effort of fighting the petrification without Luna Well's peace. What followed was a sickening laugh from Silas, who signaled his hidden archers to take aim. To make things worse, Alara realized that the silver mesh armor Silas wore was vibrating with a frequency that disrupted her seer vision, turning the world into a blur of static and shadow. "You think you're a hero, Null?" Silas sneered, stepping over a fallen crystal. "You're just a battery for a dead man." Next, the ground beneath them began to groan. Rather than surrendering, Alara closed her eyes, and reached into the darkness of her own mind. She didn't look for the null girl. She looked for the fire she had felt in the Luna well. Because of that, her soul stretched outward, touching the ancient veins of power running through the mountain. In that moment, the world tilted, and she saw the truth of Silas's armor. It wasn't just protection. It was a siphon, stealing the mountain's life force just like the council stole hers. Looking back, I should have realized that your strength is a lie, Ilara whispered, her voice sounding like a chorus of echoes. Without warning, she didn't just hold Fenris's hand. She pushed her power into him. The effect was immediate and violent. Fenris's eyes flared a blinding molten gold, and his obsidian fur stood on end like static electricity. As the bond pulsed, he let out a roar that physically pushed Silas back, and the force of it cracking the stone floor. Even so, the strain on Ilara was immense. Her chest ached as if her ribs were being crushed by invisible hands, yet she refused to let go. Moments later, the midpoint shift shattered everything she thought she knew. As she channeled the mountain's energy, a vision flooded her mind that wasn't a memory. It was a revelation. She saw the High Council's true faces, and they weren't just wolves. They were hollows, shifters who had lost their wolves long ago and were using the seer's blood and the king's stone heart to stay alive. In fact, the harvest ritual wasn't for the kingdom. It was a feeding frenzy for a pack of immortal parasites. Fenris, they aren't just traitors, she gasped, her thoughts spinning. They're empty. The realization hit Fenris like a physical blow. His rage transformed from a wild beast's hunger into a king's justice. Between them, something cracked, a barrier in their bond that had kept their minds separate. Suddenly, she could feel his strategic brilliance, and he could feel her intuitive foresight. They were no longer two people tethered by a curse. They were one mind in two bodies. Soon after, Silas realized he had lost the advantage. He signaled his archers to fire, but Fenris moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics. He didn't just dodge the arrows, he caught them, snapping the silver shafts in his teeth. More importantly, Ilara used her new spirit sight to point out the weak points in the cavern's ceiling. With a single, calculated strike from Fenris, a massive stalactite fell, crushing the path between them and the archers. "We have to go," Ilara urged, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "Leo is in the lower dungeons, not the altar. They're using him as a backup." "Then we go to the depths," Fenris vowed, his voice a low, steady rumble. Eventually, they retreated through a hidden crevice in the back of the cave, leaving a frustrated Silas screaming behind the wall of rubble. As the sky darkened outside, they found themselves on a ledge overlooking the entire kingdom. Ilara looked at the citadel in the distance, glowing with a sickly purple light. She felt it, etched in fire, the weight of the task ahead. They weren't just running for their lives anymore. They were going back to the heart of the monster to cut it out. Deep down, she knew the truth. To save Leo and the kingdom, she would have to step fully into the light she had spent her life hiding from. The ghost was gone. The seer had arrived. More importantly, she realized that Fenris's touch didn't just ground him, it empowered her. They were a closed circuit of fire and stone, and the council had no idea that their battery had just become a bomb. And she let it happen. The wind howled across the ledge like a dying beast, but Elara didn't flinch because she could feel Fenris's warmth anchoring her to the earth. She looked down at the citadel, a sprawling stone predator crouched in the valley below, and realized that her life of hiding was officially dead. The ghost had been buried in the cavern rubble, and what remained was a seer with fire in her veins and a king with a debt of blood to collect. Still, her heart hammered against her ribs as she thought of Leo trapped in those lightless depths, his small hands likely clutching the very bars she had once polished. What followed was a moment of heavy, silent resolve as Fenris turned to her, his obsidian fur matted with stone dust and silver ash. He didn't ask if she was ready. He simply opened his hand, waiting for her to bridge the gap. In fact, the space between them burned with a new, terrifying intensity that made the previous nights feel like a cold dream. Because she was now his eyes and he was her strength, the blood anchor had evolved into something much more dangerous, a shared soul. If we enter those gates, there is no turning back, Fenris rumbled, his voice a low vibration that made her bones hum. Next, they began the treacherous descent toward the citadel's back entrance, a jagged path used only by the mountain goats and the desperate. Elara led the way, her spirit sight cutting through the midnight gloom to reveal the shimmering purple wards the council had placed on the perimeter. Then, despite that, she didn't feel weak. She felt like a weapon being unsheathed. Every step he took behind her was a heavy, rhythmic promise of protection that kept her fear from turning into a paralyzing frost. Truth be told, she didn't know if her body could handle the strain of the infiltration. Not only that, but the deeper they went into the valley, the more the air smelled of the hollows. That scentless, empty void that signaled the presence of the council's parasites. She felt it, etched in fire, the weight of her destiny pressing down on her shoulders. She had to stay human long enough to save Leo, even as her wolf screamed for the release of the hunt. Soon after, they reached the iron postern, a rusted gate hidden by a centuries-old landslide. Elara pressed her palm to the cold metal, using her seer blood to whisper to the lock, sensing the internal mechanisms as if they were her own joints. As the silence stretched, the gate groaned open, revealing a dripping tunnel that led straight into the citadel's bowels. To make things worse, the tunnel was lined with silver dust traps designed to strip a wolf of his skin. "Wait!" Elara whispered, pulling Fenris back before he could step into a cloud of shimmering death. She used her power to weave a protective veil around them, a shimmering golden bubble that acted as a secondary anchor. In that moment, the physical proximity between them became a burning, intense fire of mutual survival. She leaned her back against his chest, her head tucked under his chin, feeling the raw power of his heartbeat through his obsidian fur. Maybe it was fate that brought a scentless girl to a stone king, or maybe it was just the only way the world could be saved. In the quiet that followed, they moved through the tunnels like twin shadows. Fenris moved with a silent, predatory grace, his claws clicking softly against the stone as he scanned the darkness for guards. Yet, as they approached the lower dungeons, a sudden wave of nausea hit Ilara. She felt a psychic scream. Leo. The boy was being moved to the primary ritual chamber because the council realized their backup was now their only hope. "They're taking him!" she gasped, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and terror. Without another word, Fenris surged forward, his speed increasing until he was a blur of black shadow. He didn't care about stealth anymore. He cared about his mate's pain. Because of that, he smashed through a heavy oak door, sending 2 hollow guards flying across the corridor like broken dolls. The air thickened with the sound of alarms, a shrill, metallic ringing that echoed through the citadel like a death knell. Moments later, they were standing at the entrance to the great hall, the very place where Ilara had spent years scrubbing floors. To make things worse, Silas was there, waiting for them with a dozen Silverclaw enforcers and a bound, terrified Leo. The boy's eyes locked on Ilara, and for a heartbeat, time stood still. Ilara felt a growl rise in her throat, not a maid's whimper, but a queen's roar. "Looking back, you should have killed me when I was just a ghost!" she shouted, her golden eyes blazing. Still, the council elders stepped from the shadows, their withered faces twisted into hungry grins. They didn't see a king or a seer. They saw a feast. Between them, and something cracked, the last of the ancient wards keeping the citadel's power in check. Ilara grabbed Fenris's hand, her grip so tight her knuckles turned white, and she felt his obsidian fur ripple as he prepared for the final, bloody push. And she let it happen. The air in the great hall was a suffocating shroud of silver dust and malice. Ilara stood at the center of the trap, her fingers white-knuckled around Fenris's hand, because she knew that the moment the skin-to-skin contact broke, he would be lost to the stone. Across the vast expanse of marble she had once polished until her hands bled, Silas held a jagged silver blade to Leo's throat. She didn't know what scared her more, the predatory hunger in the council elder's eyes, or the way Fenris's grip was beginning to slacken as the hollow wards began to drain the room of light. Still, the silence was a heavy physical blow before the chaos erupted. To make things worse, the council elders didn't attack with wolf strength. They used spirit hooks, invisible tethers of dark magic that latched onto Ilara's seer energy. What followed was a sickening wrench in her gut as her power was pulled in a dozen different directions. Because she was trying to hold Fenris together while shielding Leo, her own life force began to flicker like a candle in a gale. In fact, she could feel the edges of her vision turning gray, the same cold, dead gray as the king's granite skin. "Let the boy go!" Ilara screamed, her voice cracking under the psychic strain. Next, Silas delivered the major blow they hadn't prepared for. Rather than fighting Fenris head-on, he activated the grand siphon beneath the floorboards. The marble floor tiles beneath Ilara's feet began to glow with a sickly violet light, acting as a reverse anchor. It didn't just pull on her magic, it mimicked her touch. Without warning, Fenris let out a strangled roar of confusion as his senses were tricked. He turned his head toward the violet light, his eyes glazing over as the machine stole the connection Ilara had fought so hard to maintain. No! Fenris, look at me! She cried, but her voice was drowned out by the mechanical hum of the siphon. Before she could move, a blast of concussive force slammed into her chest, throwing her backward. Her hand slipped from his. The separation felt like her heart was being torn out through her ribs. As the silence roared, she watched in slow-motion horror as the gray petrification raced up Fenris's legs and chest. He reached for her, his obsidian fur turning to cold, unmoving stone in the span of a breath, his mouth frozen in a silent, agonized plea. Moments later, Ilara was pinned to the floor by two Silverclaw enforcers, her face pressed against the cold stone. She felt it, etched in fire, the utter despair of a bond severed. To make things worse, Silas dragged Leo toward the center of the hall, right next to the now frozen king. The council elders circled them like vultures, their scentless presence a mocking reminder of her null past. Deep down, she knew the truth. They had played her from the start, using her love to lure the king back into his cage. You were so easy to manipulate, little ghost. Silas sneered, his shadow falling over her. You gave him a heart just so we could watch it stop. Despite that, Ilara tried to crawl toward Fenris's stone feet, her fingers clawing at the marble. Yet the guards kicked her back, and the elders began the final harvest. They didn't just want her eyes now. They wanted the boy's blood to seal the king's stone prison forever. She watched as Leo's eyes filled with tears, his small body shaking as the high priest raised a ritual dagger. In that moment, Ilara confronted her deepest fear, that she was exactly what everyone said she was. Nothing. By the time the first drop of Leo's blood hit the floor, Ilara had reached her lowest point. She lay broken on the floor, her seer sight darkened, and her king a statue once more. The goal seemed impossible. The council was too old, too hungry, and she was just a scentless maid who had failed everyone she loved. As the silence stretched, she felt a hollow ache in her chest that was deeper than any wound. Maybe it was fate that she should die here, on the very floors she had spent her life cleaning. How could I have been so blind? She whispered into the dust. I thought a kiss could save a kingdom, but I've only built a tomb. What followed was a cold, final resignation. She stopped fighting the guards, her body going limp as she prepared for the end. The high priest stepped toward her, his fingers reaching for her eyes to complete the harvest. In this quiet, bleak moment, the great hall felt like a graveyard. Her thoughts spun back to the first time she touched the stone king, now remembering the heat that had pulsed in his chest. Now there was only ice. In the stillness that followed, a single, soft sound broke the priest's chant. It was the sound of a small, rhythmic thud. Thump, 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 thump. It wasn't coming from the king. It was coming from Ilara's own soul. She realized the blood anchor wasn't just skin to skin. It was a promise. Even though they were apart, she could still feel the embers of his rage buried deep within the granite. Because of that, a tiny spark of defiance flickered in the darkness of her despair. I am not a ghost, she breathed, her voice a low, dangerous rumble, and she let it happen. The high priest's fingers were inches from Ilara's face, but he didn't see the golden wildfire igniting in her darkened pupils. She lay pinned to the marble, her body a broken shell, yet her soul was reaching through the stone floor to the very foundations of the citadel. Because the council had spent a century stealing the land's life force, the earth itself was screaming for a voice, and Alara realized she was the only one who could hear it. Truth be told, she wasn't a null because she lacked a scent. She was a vessel that had been kept empty so she could hold the power of 1,000 ancestors. Still, the air in the hall began to vibrate with a low, bone-shaking frequency that made the silver dust lanterns flicker and die. Silas paused, his blade hovering over Leo's throat, his expression shifting from triumph to a sudden creeping unease. What followed was a sound like 1,000 glass bells shattering at once. Ilara's spirit sight didn't just return, it exploded, revealing the hollow tethers for what they were, brittle, starving threads of stolen time. Because of that, she stopped fighting the guards with her muscles and instead fought them with her mind. "Get off me!" she rasped, and the command was so heavy with seer authority that the two enforcers were physically blasted off her, their bodies hitting the pillars with a sickening thud. Next, Ilara stood up, her movements slow and deliberate like a predator emerging from a long winter. Rather than looking at Silas, she looked at the stone statue of Fenris. She didn't need to touch his skin to find the anchor. She could feel his heartbeat through the very air they shared. In fact, the distance between them didn't matter anymore, because she was the bridge between the living and the dead. She felt it, etched in fire, the moment the despair turned into a cold, sharp resolve. "Looking back, you should have left me in the dust," she said, her voice echoing through the rafters like a thunderclap. Before Silas could react, Ilara raised her hands, and the violet light of the grand siphon began to turn a brilliant, blinding gold. She wasn't fighting the machine. She was overloading it with the raw, unfiltered agony of every null who had ever been discarded by the council. To make things worse for the elders, their spirit hooks began to backfire, pulling Ilara's righteous fury into their own withered bodies. As the silence roared, the high priest let out a strangled cry as his hands began to turn to gray, crumbling granite. Moments later, the hall was a vortex of light and shadow. Ilara sprinted toward Leo, her body moving on instinct as she tackled the boy away from Silas's blade. Without thinking, she threw her cloak over her brother, shielding him from the magical fallout. But then she turned to the king. She knew the final plan required a sacrifice she had been terrified to make. To shatter the stone for good, she had to give up the one thing that made her a seer, her physical sight. "Fenris, can you hear me?" she whispered into the psychic void. "I'm coming for you." As if fate demanded it, she reached out and pressed her palms against the king's stone eyes. The space between them burned with a white-hot intensity that seared her retinas. She felt the curse's resistance, a jagged silver wall of hate, but she pushed through it with the weight of her love. Between them, something cracked for the final time. The stone didn't just peel away, it exploded into fine white powder,
and a roar that had been bottled up for a century finally tore through the great hall. Soon after, the dust settled to reveal Fenris in his full, primal alpha glory. He stood 7 feet of obsidian muscle and fury, his claws extended and his eyes glowing like twin suns. Yet, Ilara stumbled back, her hands over her own eyes as the world around her faded into a soft, permanent blur. She couldn't see the fear on Silas's face, but she could feel the heat of Fenris's presence as he stepped between her and the council. "You took her sight," Fenris growled, the floorboards splintering under his weight. "So I will take your world." With every step he took, the citadel groaned, the stones themselves recognizing their rightful master. Ilara felt Leo's small hand slip into hers, his presence a grounding comfort in the new darkness of her world. More importantly, she felt the blood anchor pulse with a steady, unbreakable rhythm. They were ready for the final confrontation. The final push had begun, and there was nowhere left for the monsters to hide. Eventually, the remaining guards fled or fell to their knees as the Alpha's aura washed over them. Silas tried to make a final break for the ritual altar, but Fenris moved like a shadow in the night, his predatory focus locked on the man who had dared to touch his mate. Ilara stood in the center of the chaos, her head held high, guided by the golden threads of the bond that only she could see. "It's time to end this," she whispered, the words hanging in the air like a promise. And she let it happen. The great hall was no longer a palace. It was a slaughterhouse of shadows and light. Ilara stood in the center of the wreckage, her world now a canvas of blurred shapes and glowing spirit threads because she had traded her physical sight for the king's freedom. She couldn't see the terror on Silas's face, but she could hear the frantic, uneven rhythm of his heart and the rasp of his breath as he backed away. Still, she felt the anchor between her and Fenris pulsing like a living sun, a tether of fire that allowed her to see the world through his golden eyes. What followed was the final, brutal reckoning. To make things worse for the cowering council, Fenris didn't just attack. He became a hurricane of obsidian fur and primal justice. He moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics, his claws shredding the silver mesh armor of the enforcers as if it were wet parchment. Because Ilara was channeling the mountain's raw energy into the bond, every blow Fenris landed echoed with the weight of 1,000 years of suppressed rage. In fact, the stone pillars of the hall began to crack and weep as the citadel itself rejected the hollow masters who had poisoned it. "Finish it, Fenris!" Ilara cried, her voice ringing out with a queen's authority. Next, the climax reached its peak of absolute intensity. The high priest, desperate and crumbling, lunged for the ritual altar to trigger a self-destruct ward that would bury them all. Rather than letting go, Ilara pushed her spirit sight to the limit, pinpointing the flow of magical ley lines beneath the floor. Without thinking, she slammed her palm against the marble, sending a surge of golden light through the ground. The moment her energy locked with the altar's core, the violet wards turned white and shattered. As if fate demanded it, Fenris leaped across the hall in a single, massive bound. He didn't use a weapon.
He used the raw, crushing strength of his alpha wolf to pin the high priest against the crumbling altar. Without another word, he let out a roar that physically tore the hollow spirits from the council elders' bodies, leaving them as nothing more than piles of gray ash. The air thickened with the scent of ozone and victory. Soon after, Silas attempted to crawl toward the exit, but Fenris was there in a heartbeat, his obsidian shadow looming over the man who had dared to touch his mate. "You are nothing," Fenris rumbled, his voice a low, final tolling of a bell. In the quiet that followed, the great hall fell silent, save for the crackle of dying magic and Alara's heavy breathing. The central conflict was resolved, and the hollow council was no more. But then, the weight of her sacrifice began to pull at Alara's knees. She stumbled, her world of shadows spinning, but she didn't hit the floor. Fenris was there, his massive warm arms catching her, his obsidian fur soft against her scarred face. Even though she couldn't see his expression, she felt the burning, intense fire of his devotion radiating through the bond. "The boy is safe," Fenris whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in a century. "You did it, Ilara. You saved us all." Moments later, Leo ran to them, his small arms wrapping around Ilara's waist. The falling action began as the remaining Null servants emerged from the shadows, looking at Ilara not as a ghost, but as their savior. To make things worse for the few surviving guards, they dropped their spears in unison, kneeling before the king and the seer queen. Because the curse was permanently broken, the gray stone tint disappeared from Fenris's skin forever, replaced by the living warmth of a man who was finally, truly free. That night, the citadel was filled with the light of 1,000 candles, but the real glow came from the restoration of the land. Ilara sat on the royal balcony, the night air carrying the scent of pine and rain for the first time in her life. She realized that while her physical eyes were dark, she could see the souls of the people and the heartbeat of the forest more clearly than ever. Truth be told, she didn't miss the old world. More importantly, she felt Fenris kneel beside her, his hand finding hers with a gentle, practiced ease. "I will be your eyes," he promised, his voice a tender vow. "And you will be my soul." Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was the choice of a simple maid who dared to kiss a king, but the prophecy was finally complete. They didn't just have a kingdom. They had a pack. As the silence stretched, Fenris shared his life force with her through the bond, a steady stream of alpha energy that ensured she would never be weak again. Their transformation was complete, from the ghost and the statue to the Luna and the king. Come morning, the coronation was a celebration of found family and rebirth. Ilara stood at the center of the dais, Leo at her side and Fenris at her back. She didn't need sight to know that the people were cheering. She felt it, etched in fire, the sense of belonging she had hunted for her entire life. Her world was no longer gray. It was a vibrant tapestry of shared heartbeats and unbreakable promises, and she let it happen